Berlin, January 30th, 1943, 10:57 hours. The Reichshauptstadt is cold and grey. In the air defense bunker beneath the Wilhelmstrasse, Hauptmann Karl Reinhardt has been awake for 19 hours. He is 41 years old. A veteran of the Spanish Civil War, a graduate of the Luftkriegsakademie, he has spent the last 2 years of this war reading radar plots over the Reich, and he is, by every measure that matters in his profession, very good at his job. Reinhardt's job is simple. When an enemy aircraft enters German airspace, he vectors fighters to intercept it. He has done this thousands of times. He knows the speed of every Allied bomber type in service. He knows the Lancaster. He knows the Halifax. He knows the B-17 Flying Fortress. He knows their cruising altitudes, their climb rates, their vulnerable approaches. At 10:57 hours, 3 plots appear on his board. Coming in fast from the northwest, very fast. He calls for an altitude check, 25,000 feet. He calls for a speed check. The reply, in knots, converts in his head to 400 miles per hour. There is no Allied bomber that flies at that speed at that altitude. There is no aircraft on Earth that does. He orders his controllers to recheck. They recheck. The plots have not slowed. He scrambles a staffel of Messerschmitt 109s from Uterburg. The fighters climb. They strain. They reach for the contacts. By the time they make 25,000 feet, the plots are already crossing the city center. At 1100 hours exactly, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring steps to a microphone in the Air Ministry building above Reinhardt's head to begin the 10-year anniversary broadcast of the National Socialist accession to power. He gets 4 sentences out. Then, the bombs land. Reinhardt writes in his after-action report that the contacts were too fast for his fighters to engage. He writes that this is not possible. He writes that there must be a fault in his radar, or in his procedures, or in his men. He proposes 3 explanations: a spurious echo from the Freya transmitter, a coordinated jamming effort, a misread of altitude by the plot officer. He writes the report carefully because Berlin has just been bombed in the middle of a Reichsmarschall broadcast, and someone will have to answer for it. He cannot bring himself to write the only sentence that actually fits the data: the British have an aircraft that we cannot catch. This is not a story about a raid on Berlin. This is a story about a paradox, about how an aircraft built of balsa wood and birch plywood, assembled by furniture makers in a small English town, was faster than every fighter the Luftwaffe could put in the sky, about why German engineers, the best metallurgists in the world, could not catch a bomber glued together by carpenters. This is the story of the de Havilland Mosquito. Part 1. The German Worldview. The German to understand why Hauptmann Reinhardt's radar plots did not make sense. You need to understand what German aviation was in 1943. And to understand that, you do not go back to the start of this war. You go back to 1915. That year, an engineer named Hugo Junkers, in a workshop in Dessau, built the world's first all-metal aircraft, the Junkers J1. It had a stressed skin of corrugated duralumin. It had no fabric, no wood. It was an industrial object, not a craftsman's object. And it represented the entire German aeronautical future. By the late 1930s, every operational aircraft in the Luftwaffe was built this way. The Messerschmitt 109, the Focke-Wulf 190, the Heinkel 111, the Junkers 88, all of them stressed skin aluminum monocoque, all of them the product of the Deutsche Versuchsanstalt für Luftfahrt, the great German aviation research establishment and its decades of metallurgical research. By 1937, German universities were producing more aeronautical engineers per year than the rest of Europe combined. The technical colleges at Stuttgart, Braunschweig, and Berlin-Charlottenburg taught stressed skin theory as the only serious method of modern airframe construction. Students wrote dissertations on stringer spacing, on rivet load distribution, on the precise heat treatment cycles for duralumin sheet. They did not write dissertations on plywood. Plywood was a subject for boat builders. The doctrine was complete. It went like this. A modern combat aircraft requires high performance. High performance requires strength-to-weight efficiency. Strength-to-weight efficiency requires aluminum alloy stressed skin monocoque construction. Anything else, any aircraft built of wood, of fabric, of any pre-war material, was a relic. The Germans even had a word for the old wooden fabric biplanes: Kistenfahren, crate driving. It was not a compliment. The assessment was not insane. It was based on available data. The problem was that it was 4 years out of date, because while German factories at Augsburg and Bremen were retooling for ever larger runs of stressed skin aluminum fighters, a small private firm at Hatfield, in Hertfordshire, England, was quietly turning that doctrine on its head. In July 1938, Geoffrey de Havilland Sr., head of his family aircraft firm, wrote a letter to Air Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman of the British Air Ministry. The letter argued that in the coming war, aluminum would be scarce, strategic materials would be rationed, skilled metal workers would be conscripted. But wood was still available. And the British furniture industry, the British coach builders, the British boat yards, all of these could be turned to aircraft work in a matter of weeks. Where the Germans needed an aluminum mill, the British needed a glue pot. The Air Ministry read the letter. The Air Ministry rejected the idea. They rejected it again in October 1938. They rejected it again in 1939. The specification P.1336 that the ministry was called for heavy bombers, 4 engines, multiple defensive turrets, crewed by 7 men. The de Havilland proposal called for the opposite: a bomber with no guns, no turrets, a crew of 2, made of wood. The Royal Air Force officer who chaired one of the rejection meetings is recorded as judging the concept unlikely to survive contact with the enemy. Pause on that sentence. Unlikely to survive contact with the enemy. That sentence is the entire German world view, written down by an Englishman. It says, an aircraft without armor is a coffin. An aircraft without guns is prey. An aircraft made of wood is a museum piece. The British Air Ministry and the German Luftwaffe agreed on one thing in 1939, even if they could not agree on anything else. They agreed that the de Havilland concept was unserious. They agreed it was the work of a single eccentric family firm at Hatfield that had not understood the modern industrial age. They were both wrong, but they would not learn how wrong until 3 mosquitoes crossed Hauptmann Reinhardt's radar plot 4 years later. Part 2. The tool that broke the model. Here is what de Havilland actually built. The fuselage was a balsa wood sandwich, 2 skins of birch plywood, just over a 1/16 of an inch thick each, with a 1/2-inch core of Ecuadorian balsa between them. The whole assembly was bonded together with synthetic resin glue. The shape was formed over a concrete mold in 2 half shells, like a model boat hull. When the 2 halves were joined, you had an oval tube light enough for 2 men to lift, but stronger by weight than anything in the Luftwaffe's inventory. The wings were Sitka spruce and Douglas fir, with a plywood skin laid over them in a single one-piece spar. The control surfaces were fabric over wood frame. The cockpit canopy was perspex. The engines, and this was the point, were 2 Rolls-Royce Merlins, the same engines that powered the Spitfire and the Hurricane, the same engines that had won the Battle of Britain. 2 Merlin engines on an airframe made of wood, with a crew of 2, and no defensive armament. That was the design. The first prototype, serial W4050, was assembled in a small farm building beside a moated manor house at Salisbury Hall, north of London, in the autumn of 1940. Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., son of the founder, took it on its first flight at Hatfield on November 25, 1940, at 15:45 hours. He flew it for 30 minutes. He reported only one small problem with tail buffet, easily resolved. 3 months later, the aircraft was at the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment at Boscombe Down for performance trials. The official trial report recorded a maximum speed of 392 miles per hour at 22,000 feet, with single-stage Merlin engines on its very first set of tests. The fastest Spitfire in service that month managed 360 miles per hour. By 1943, with 2-stage Merlin engines fitted, a Mosquito night fighter, serial MP469, was tested at 408 miles per hour, at 27,800 feet, 408 miles per hour. The fastest German fighter in service that year, the Messerschmitt 109 G6, managed 386 miles per hour in the same air. Read that again. The British wooden bomber was 22 miles per hour faster than the German fighter sent to intercept it. That gap, those 22 miles per hour, is the story. 22 miles per hour between an aircraft built of beechwood and birch plywood, and the most advanced single-seat fighter the German aviation industry could produce. 22 miles per hour between a chairmaker's apprentice in Buckinghamshire and a stressed skin engineer at Augsburg. 22 miles per hour that the Luftwaffe could never make up. It meant a Mosquito over Berlin could not be caught. It meant the Mosquito could fly in daylight deep into Reich airspace without an escort. It meant the loss rate of the Mosquito in bomber command operations across all roles came to under 1% per sortie. The Lancaster lost 2.13%. The Halifax lost 2.6%. The Sterling lost 3.8%. The little wooden bomber that the Air Ministry had said could not survive contact with the enemy was the safest combat aircraft in the Royal Air Force. It was also the most versatile. The same airframe became a low-level fighter bomber, a high-altitude pathfinder, a night intruder, a long-range maritime strike aircraft, a photographic reconnaissance machine, and a precision attack platform that could level a Gestapo headquarters at street level from 100 feet. 37 different production variants, 7,781 aircraft built, operated by 12 air forces, built in Britain, in Canada at Downsview, Toronto, and in Australia at Bankstown. You should hold one image in your mind from this period. November 1944, Wing Commander Branson Burbage of No. 85 Squadron Royal Air Force, taking off from Swannington in a Mosquito night fighter. Burbage had registered as a conscientious objector at the start of the war, then changed his mind during the Blitz. On the night of 4th November, he flew one patrol. In a single sortie, he shot down one Messerschmitt 110 and 3 Junkers 88s. By the end of the war, he had 21 confirmed kills at night, plus 3 V-1s destroyed, the top night fighter ace of the entire Allied effort. After the war, he became an evangelical Anglican preacher. He never spoke much about the killing, except to say once to an interviewer that he had always tried to aim for the wings of enemy aircraft and never for the cockpit. He said, "I never wanted to kill anyone." He said it as though, even 40 years later, the war was something he had been asked to do, not something he had wanted to do. That is the man in the wooden aircraft. Men like Branson Burbage, like the Pathfinder crews, like the navigators flying through anti-aircraft fire to mark a Berlin railway yard, deserve to be remembered. Every like on this video keeps the story of the Mosquito visible for a few more people. It does not cost anything. It matters more than it should. Part 3. The deeper system. To understand why the British could build the Mosquito and the Germans could not, you have to leave the airfield and walk into an English market town. In Buckinghamshire, High Wycombe. Population in 1940, around 30,000. The local industry for 200 years had been chairs. The beech woods of the Chiltern Hills had been turned by Wycombe craftsmen into Windsor chairs since the 18th century. By the 1930s, the town had become Britain's furniture capital. The firms had names like E. Gom, Parker Knoll, Stiles and Milling, Dancer and Hearn, Frederick Parker and Sons. They made chairs, dining tables, sideboards, suites of bedroom furniture. They employed thousands of skilled woodworkers who could shape, laminate, and finish hardwood to a tolerance of 1/1000th of an inch. In 1941, Geoffrey de Havilland sent contracts to High Wycombe, but before the contracts went out, the design itself had to be drawn. And that happened not in a factory, not in an Air Ministry building, but in a moated 17th century manor house, 10 miles north of London, Salisbury Hall. The de Havilland design team moved in during October 1939. 8 men under chief designer R.E. Bishop, working in the main hall on borrowed drawing boards. They moved there as a security precaution. They were afraid that the British government itself would shut their project down if the office was easy to find. The prototype was assembled in a small farm building beside the moat, the roof disguised to look like an agricultural shed. Lord Beaverbrook, the Minister of Aircraft Production, ordered work on the Mosquito stopped in the summer of 1940. The order was, in Beaverbrook's words, not very specific. It was largely ignored by Sir Wilfrid Freeman at the Air Ministry, who did not pass it on to de Havilland. Beaverbrook coined a nickname for the whole project. He called it Freeman's Folly. The nickname stuck. Freeman ignored that too. By 1943, the same men who had been making 3-piece lounge suites the year before were laminating Sitka spruce wing spars for Mosquito bombers. The same factories that had turned beechwood into chair legs were turning out fuselage shells. The same workshops were now producing rudders, ailerons, tailplanes. At Higham's works, finished fuselages stood on trestles in the yard before being loaded onto lorries. At Dancer and Hearn, wing spars were laminated in heated presses. At Stiles and Mealing, an entire Mosquito fuselage was photographed in the works yard, surrounded by women in headscarves who had been hired off the production lines to file timber to specification. Roughly 5,000 of the 7,781 Mosquitoes built worldwide contained parts made in High Wycombe. Read that sentence again. 5,000 of the 7,781 Mosquitoes contained parts made in High Wycombe by chairmakers. This was the system, the industrial logic that the Germans could not see and could not copy, even when they later tried. Here is the money number, 407 thou an hour at 27,800 feet. That was what an aircraft built from beechwood furniture firms, joined with synthetic resin glue and powered by 2 engines from a Derby motorworks could do. 408 miles per hour, 22 miles per hour faster than the fighter sent to catch it. Loss rate under 1%. A piano factory could not literally do this work, despite what Göring would later say, but a chair factory could, and a coach builder's shop and a boatyard, and the wood-handling tradition of an entire small market town in the Chilterns, going back to the reign of George III. The Germans, on paper, had every advantage. They had Hugo Junkers and his stressed skin doctrine. They had the great metallurgy laboratories at the Deutsche Versuchsanstalt für Luftfahrt. They had Krupp and Heinkel and Messerschmitt. They had a strategic materials position that, despite Göring's later rhetoric, was no worse than the British position until late 1943. They had everything except the right tradition. Britain had something Germany did not have. Britain had 200 years of amateur engineering. Britain had Frank Whittle inventing the jet engine on his own time. Britain had Barnes Wallis working out the bouncing bomb at a kitchen table in Effingham. Britain had a family firm, the de Havillands, that could simply build an aircraft on its own initiative when the Air Ministry was not interested. Britain had a furniture trade that could become an aviation industry overnight because the skills were already there in the hands of men who had been making Windsor chairs for their fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers. This was not a story about racial superiority. It was a story about institutional flexibility. The Germans had been told for 30 years that wood was a relic. The British had never quite been told that because the British were not really listening to anyone in particular. The British were tinkering in sheds. The British were running family firms out of Hatfield and Bristol and Coventry. The British, in short, had not industrialized aviation hard enough to forget where aviation came from. They were not professional engineers in the German sense. They were not industrial titans. They were chair makers and coach builders and a family firm with one stubborn private conviction. The Mosquito did not slow down. If you have a father or a grandfather or an uncle who worked in the Wycombe furniture trade during the war, or who served in Bomber Command, or who flew with the Royal Air Force Pathfinder Force, I would be grateful to hear their names and units in the comments. These stories are how the memory survives. The Wycombe Museum still has the photograph of the women at Styles and Mealing standing beside a Mosquito fuselage in the works yard. Their names have mostly been lost. The aircraft they helped to build went to Berlin 170 times. Part 4. The Germans realized too late. There is There's forest north of Berlin called the Schorfheide. Hermann Göring kept a country estate there. He called it Karinhall, after his first wife. On March 18, 1943, 6 weeks after 3 mosquitoes had ruined his 10-year anniversary broadcast, Göring summoned every senior figure in the German aviation industry to Karinhall for a conference. Willy Messerschmitt was there. Ernst Heinkel was there. Claudius Dornier was there. Field Marshal Erhard Milch was there. The minutes of the meeting were taken by stenographers, preserved on microfilm, and are now in the Imperial War Museum in London. Read what Göring said. This is the verbatim record. I could go mad when I see the Mosquito. I turn green and yellow with envy. The Englishman, who can afford even more aluminum than we can, builds himself a fine wooden aircraft with a speed that he has just now increased yet again. He went on. Furniture makers, he said. Every piano factory over there is building one. He turned to Messerschmitt directly. Why are we still searching for the answer? He asked. Let's build the Mosquito. That is the simplest thing we can do. The most powerful man in German aviation, 6 weeks after 3 British wooden bombers had silenced his anniversary microphone, was asking his industrialists to copy a British aircraft. He was not entirely wrong about everything. He was right that the British was producing the Mosquito in furniture works. He was right that the wood and glue construction was faster to manufacture than aluminum. He was right that any aviation tradition that scorned wood had made a mistake. What he was wrong about, what he could never admit, was that none of this could be reversed in 1943, because Germany did not have High Wycombe. Germany did not have a furniture trade ready for war work at scale. Germany had not spent 30 years tinkering with wooden airframes for sport flying. The German woodworking tradition that did exist had been deliberately marginalized by the Junkers metal doctrine since 1918. The skill base was gone. The factories were tooled for aluminum. The adhesives were not ready. The glues that did exist did not survive German weather and German altitudes. Kurt Tank, the Focke-Wulf chief designer, was given the contract anyway. He designed a German Mosquito, and he named it. He called it the TAR-54 Mosquito. The prototype flew on July 1, 1943. It was promising. It used a phenolic resin adhesive called Tego film, manufactured by Goldschmidt of Wuppertal. In May 1944, Royal Air Force Bomber Command, flying Mosquitoes, bombed the Goldschmidt works. Pause on that. The Mosquito bombed the factory that made the glue for the German Mosquito. The Tego film factory was destroyed. The substitute adhesive supplied to Focke-Wulf was acidic. It ate the plywood from the inside. Ta-154 wings began to fail in flight. Test pilots were killed. Tank was summoned to the Obersalzberg in May 1944 to explain. Göring accused him of sabotage. The program was halted in August. The German Mosquito had been destroyed by the British Mosquito. Adolf Galland, the general of fighters, recorded the final verdict in his post-war memoir. "We were practically powerless against the mosquitoes," he wrote. "In daytime, they flew without losses and went wherever their mission took them. At night, they chased the population out of their beds. The population was justifiably annoyed and started to grumble. The fat one cannot even cope with a few silly mosquitoes." Göring did try. He raised 2 special anti-mosquito fighter wings, Jagdgeschwader 25 and Jagdgeschwader 50, equipped with high-altitude variants of the Messerschmitt 109. Galland wrote, deadpan, "As far as I know, neither of these units ever shot down a mosquito." Across the channel, while German engineers were trying to copy the Mosquito and failing, the men who actually flew the aircraft were taking it further every month. On May 27, 1943, Squadron Leader Reggie Reynolds of No. 105 Squadron and Navigator, Flight Lieutenant Edward Sizemore, known to his crew as Daisy Sizemore, flew Mosquito's 1,100 miles round trip into central Germany to attack the Carl Zeiss optical works at Jena. The visibility on the final leg was less than half a mile. They flew at 50 feet. A light anti-aircraft shell exploded in Reynolds' cockpit, wounding him. He flew the aircraft home. The London Gazette citation for Reynolds' Distinguished Service Order is the documentary record of one of the deepest daylight low-level penetrations of Germany of the war. He was years old. Daisy Sizemore, the navigator beside him, would later lead the Mosquito raid on Gestapo headquarters at Aarhus and the Mosquito raid on Gestapo headquarters at Copenhagen. He survived the war. He became Air Commodore Sizemore. He died in 2012, aged 91. The Mosquito did not slow down. Part 5. The verdict. Returned to Hauptmann Reinhardt in his Berlin radar bunker. He has been told that what he saw at 1,100 hours on January 30 was an illusion. There is no Allied aircraft that flies at 25,000 feet at 400 miles per hour. The plots must have been spurious. The intercepts must have been mishandled. Someone, somewhere in his command, is going to be reprimanded. But the bombs landed. The bombs were real. Göring's microphone went dead in mid-sentence and stayed dead for 63 minutes. The British Broadcasting Corporation in London carried the story before lunch. Hauptmann Reinhardt is not a real man. I should tell you that. The name is a stand-in for the dozens of Jagdflieger Leitoffizier, the German night fighter controllers, whose intercept reports and frustrated marginal notes are in the Bundesarchiv at Freiburg. They saw what I described him seeing. They drew the conclusions I described him drawing. They had no idea what to do about any of it. The men whose names are real are these: Geoffrey de Havilland Sr., the family firm patriarch, who refused to stop when the Air Ministry rejected his idea 3 times. His son, Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., chief test pilot, killed in 1946 in the prototype of the next aircraft his father designed. Air Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman, who ignored Lord Beaverbrook's order to cancel the project in the summer of 1940. R.E. Bishop, the chief designer, who drew the lines in a hole beside a moat. Squadron leader Reggie Reynolds, Flight Lieutenant Ted Sizemore, Wing Commander Brands Burbridge, Group Captain Percy Pickard, who died at Amiens. The chairmakers of High Wycombe, whose names are mostly lost. The Germans had Hugo Junkers and aluminum monocoque. The British had a family firm and a furniture trade. The Germans had the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the largest aviation ministry in Europe. The British had Sir Wilfrid Freeman disobeying his minister. The Germans had the Daimler-Benz 605 engine. The British had 2 Rolls-Royce Merlins, and the men of Derby who built them. The German metric was strength-to-weight ratio in an industrial alloy. The British metric was a finished aircraft in a hangar by Christmas, and they did not particularly care what it was made of. The Mosquito was not invulnerable. Mosquitoes were lost. Crews died. 2 airmen of No. 139 Squadron did not come home from the Berlin raid that began this story. Squadron leader Donald Darling and flying officer William Wright were killed by flak near Altona Grabo on the afternoon return run, and they are buried side by side at the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery at Heerstrasse in Berlin. 23 of the 24 crews who flew to Amiens prison on February 18, 1944 came home. The 24th was Group Captain Percy Pickard, Distinguished Service Order, and 2 bars, Distinguished Flying Cross, the first Royal Air Force officer to be awarded the Distinguished Service Order 3 times in the war. His tail was severed by a Focke-Wulf 190 of 7 Squadron, Fighter Wing 26, flown by Feldwebel Wilhelm Meyer, just as the bombs were going home in the Amiens prison wall. His Mosquito spun into a field. He and his navigator John Broadley are buried at St. Pierre Cemetery in Amiens. The Mosquito was a wooden aircraft, and wooden aircraft burned. It did not slow down, but it did burn. What it did, that nothing else in the war could do, was carry 2,000 pounds of bombs and later 4,000 pounds to Berlin and back faster than anything the Luftwaffe could put in the sky to stop it. It did this with a crew of 2. It did this without armor. It did this without defensive guns. It did this for less than 1% loss per sortie. And after the war, the Royal Air Force calculated that pound for pound, mile for mile, target for target, the Mosquito was almost 5 times more efficient at delivering destruction than the Lancaster. In the last 3 months of the war, the Light Night Striking Force of No. 8 Group Pathfinders flew Mosquitoes to Berlin on 36 consecutive nights. From the 20th of February 1945 to the 27th of March, every night, they lost a handful of crews across the entire campaign. By comparison, on a single night in March 1944, the heavy bomber force lost 95 Lancasters, and Halifax is attacking Nuremberg. The Mosquito was not just faster, it was, in plain accounting terms, the most efficient instrument of strategic bombing the war produced. And it was made of trees, built by hand, built by chairmakers, built out of wood. Subscribe to WW2 Dark Legacy if you want the next chapter, because there are more of these. More designers, more crews, more men whose names should not be allowed to disappear. The Wooden Wonder is one story, the Pathfinder Force is another. The men of Bletchley, who read the German night fighter codes that should have caught the Mosquito and never did, that is a third. The chairmakers of High Wycombe, whose photograph still survives at the local museum, that is a fourth. Until then, remember the men in the bombers. Remember the women in the headscarves at Styles and Mealing. Remember the apprentices at Dancer and Hearn laminating spars in heated presses on a Tuesday afternoon. Remember Geoffrey de Havilland Sr. in his office at Hatfield in 1938, writing a letter to a minister who would not read it. Remember Sir Wilfrid Freeman, who got the letter and read it and quietly defied his own government to keep the project alive. He was right. The Air Ministry was wrong. The Luftwaffe was wrong. The bomber that could not survive contact with the enemy survived contact with the enemy for 5 years and came home faster than anything sent to stop it. The Germans had Hugo Junkers. The British had a family firm. The Germans had metallurgy. The British had carpenters. The German doctrine was correct on paper. The British doctrine was correct in the air. The carpenters won.